and welcome back to Radical Engagement / Vlog Solo. This is a little bit of both, since it's not really a text I'm engaging with, it's responses to a text I engage with. But I wanted to be thorough here because it's a critique of somebody who is, in some ways, a formative figure in my political past, and also with whom I have profound disagreements, but also profound agreements. And parsing that difference is important. Now, I have said that I think ultimately the conclusions that Cutrone has adopted seem to resemble elements of neoconservatism, particularly his stance on the unitary state. I will say I don't necessarily feel like that's been responded to in a way that denies that Cutrone is adopting it, nor saying that we should reject our fight against Bonapartism. In fact, I think Cutrone is going to make very clear that while he's not endorsing this, it's something that he thinks is inevitable or is necessary to create space for the left. What space for the left, what that means, how is this different from tailing, that's all going to have to be parsed out. All right, let's get in here and get into the actual specific comments. This may be long. I think this is going to be my last video on these responses. There's also one response that I was particularly snarky to that I'm going to readdress here. And I'm going to just mention we're going to go through a lot of text today on the Jewish question, the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, which is an uncompleted and unpublished manuscript from 1848 on the Jewish question, is also from around the same period. And then we're going to jump to the end of Marx's life and look at the afterword to the second German edition of Capital, where there's more stuff on Marx's own understanding of his relationship to Hegel. I'm also going to deal with some stuff about German idealism as the highest form of bourgeois consciousness, which it may be, but in the case of understanding bourgeois rights in America, I'm not so sure that they've ever been justified on categorical imperative grounds. And so we're going to get to that as well. Those are the comments that I think needs to be addressed. Now, there's a lot that depends on how you read emerges from versus is, and how important you think that distinction is. So we're going to get to that. But one thing I'm going to address first is Cutrone pointing out fairly that I dropped a paragraph from his article, and it ends up being one kind of important. So I'm going to go into that right now. The paragraph I dropped is a short one, but it is an important one. In this sense, we have the historic right and obligation, the duty as a society, to experience politically the phenomenon of Trump. For it shows all the weak and blind spots of liberal democracy and capitalism. As Tocqueville said, ironically, of American democracy, the public receives the government it deserves. And as a society, we'll also get the public we deserve. Trump demands that we confront the problem of politics this society has produced in capitalism. Trump is by far not the worst example of it. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say that if political neutrality towards Trump or Biden is what we should be doing, in some ways, I have never disagreed with that. In fact, in 2016, when people were railing against the Why Not Trump article, I actually stated, even if Trump was an acceleration towards something like fascism, which I didn't think he was, I'm not saying there aren't fascistic elements to it, because there's fascistic elements to liberalism. But liberalism is not fascism. All right? Now, that distinction may be semantic, but it depends, the elements of, racial exclusion, inclusion, modernization of the state, the totalizing state apparatus, those are not things unique to fascism or Nazism or any of the variants. So what is unique? And what is unique is a couple things. One, the implementation of a state of exception. Two, the dependence on a Bonapartist-like dictatorship or a Caesarist-like dictatorship as a representation of the body whole. 3, class collaborationism and corporatism. 4, and racialism is often seen as the way to get to class collaboration and corporatism, although it's not the only one. Integralist, distributist, Catholic thinkers actually often eschew the racial dynamics for cultural dynamics, as did the German revolutionaries, the German conservative revolutionaries. 5, total social mobilization, which is almost completely lacking today in anyone's politics. While there is mass negative partisanship, it's not the same as total social mobilization, and it's not really asking people to make a lot of sacrifices. So in this sense, while there might be post-fascist or fascistic elements to Trumpism, because there's fascistic elements in liberalism in general, and conservatism in general, Trump, for me, was not really a fascist threat, although some hangers-on to him were. And beyond that, the advance of these Trumpist ideas have actually had more success at state-level governments and the judiciary as the administrative state seems to decay, and as the Democrats tempt them to be more provocative at lower levels of government. So, if your goal was to stop the march of whatever Trumpism is, Bidenism, whatever that is, and these are largely to cults of personality, to very unattractive and deracinated cults of personality, if we're quite honest, but at least one of them can cogently speak. Barely, but you can. That is a severe problem. And Cutrone is not wrong about that. Now, where I don't agree with him is empowering that further legally. But in some ways, as we've already seen in recent court rulings, that's happened anyway. Like the end of Chevron deference, which, by the way, was not really a good thing. The moving of the administrative apparatus decisions, which is not a very long precedent, it's in my lifetime, to the administrative executive branch itself, was done partly so neoliberalization would be easier. Yes, specialists would rule, but they were still politically appointed specialists. Now, there has been norms established going all the way back to the Eisenhower White House that political appointments are made on expertise and that there's some continuity of government in the administrative state. But that is not a manifestation of technocratic democracy the way it is often sold by liberals. Basically, one unelected part of the government is fighting another unelected part of the government in a fugue. The unitary executive was pretty much validated de facto, whether we like it or not, when Barack Obama, yes, that Barack Obama, used drones to kill a U.S. citizen on foreign soil as an enemy combatant without trial. That actually was a crossing of the Rubicon in constitutional law that was never answered and has been retroactively made legal by the Trump ruling. Now, the extent of the de jure thing on executive privilege is probably not great. I do not take the Napoleon on horseback or the Cromwell in orange tan view of giving this to Trump, mainly because I don't think the unitary executive has been shown to be in the hands of anyone who's particularly competent. But the idea that Trump is the worst that this society could produce is a strange idea. I've been thinking about the meaning of regression a lot. a lot. And decadence, which is my preferred way of thinking about it. Because decadence incorporates both the possibility of renewal, but also the admission that you cannot unregress. You can't turn back time. Not its real materials. Yes, the norms we wish to evaluate history are in some ways political and normative categories. There's no way around that. But ask ourselves in a real way whether or not we should support the unitary executive against other parts of the state. The issue is all elements of the state have been less and less democratically and even republicanly responsive. Whether or not you believe Colin Crouch's post-democracy thesis from the 90s and aughts to something like the right-wing total state theory of Ron McIntyre, which is in some ways a neoconservative version, or not a neoconservative, neo-reactionary version mixed with some paleo and some neoconservatism revitalization of the opposition to the state. Both institutional and bureaucratic inertia is something the left should not just defend, and it is rife in centrist liberalism, particularly with the structuralization of capital. Now, one thing I want to eventually get to Chris on is the political economy that he is operating off of here, because we are still not dealing with those writings of Marx or with what Chris may think. I think Friedrich Pollock may be some of what he might refer me to, and the administrative society thesis of the early American iteration of the Frankfurt School. But I actually don't know that he would point me there. Anyway, so let's get back to the Marx question. Just wanted to finish off that and give my caveats. I want to go more into what is going on here. I also want to say I want to thank Chris for actually making his references easy to look up so I can read the whole thing in context, which is what he's encouraging us to do. And by the way, me reading this and commenting on it to you is not the same as you dealing with it yourself. So while I'm going to read large chunks of these, I still think it is on your job to go bust out these dusty old texts and deal with them. All right, so let's get back into what we have here. Okay, Cutrone. So we've gone through the first Marx quotation of the political and economic manuscripts, and we've gone through the letters to Ruga. So let's get to what Cutrone asserts is Marx's favorite quotation of Rousseau from On the Social Contract. And I think I think looking this up, I think I have some evidence that Chris is correct. This is one of Marx's favorite quotations. So we'll just leave that at that. I'm not contesting that. It'd be hard to prove one way or the other, but there is some documentary evidence, particularly in this way he uses it in the early Marxist period, in the 1848 on the Jewish question. I mean, the 1843 on the Jewish question. All right. Quote: Whoever dares to undertake to establish a people's institutions must feel himself capable of changing, as it were, human nature, of transforming each individual, who by himself is a complete and solitary whole, into a part of a larger whole, from which, in a sense, the individual receives his life and his being, of substituting a limited and mental existence for the physical and independent existence. He has to take from man his own powers and give him in exchange alien powers which he cannot employ without the help of other men. Rousseau, The Legislature on the Social Contracts. Marx wrote this was well formulated, but only as an abstract notion of a political man, concluding, human emancipation will only be complete when the real individual man has absorbed into himself the abstract citizen, And when the individual man in his everyday life, in his work, and in his relationships has become a species being, we need to go into what Feuerbach and Marx meant by that. And why Marx may not use it as much. And when he has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers, so that he no longer separates this social power from himself as political power. It's Marx on the Jewish question. So we're going to come back to that. So here's the text in question, which is section 1 of a response to Bruno Brouwer's Jewish question in 1843. And I'm going to read the whole thing, at least this section. The German Jews desire emancipation. What kind of emancipation do they desire? Civic, political emancipation. Bruno Brouwer replies to them, no one in Germany is politically emancipated. We are ourselves not free. How are we to free you? You Jews are egoists if you demand a special emancipation for yourself as Jews. As Germans, you ought to work for the political emancipation of Germany, and as human beings for the emancipation of mankind. And you should feel the particular kind of your oppression and your shame not as an exception to the rule, but on the contrary as a confirmation of the rule. Are the Jews demand the same status as Christian subjects of the state? In that case, they recognize that the Christian state is justified, and they recognize too the regime of general oppression. Why should they disapprove of their special yoke if they approve of the general yoke? Why should the Germans be interested in the liberation of the Jews if the Jews are not interested in the liberation of the German? The Christian state knows only privileges. In this state, the Jew has the privilege of being a Jew. As a Jew, he has rights which Christians do not have. Why would he want rights which he does not have, but which Christians enjoy? And wanting to be emancipated from the Christian state, the Jew is demanding that the Christian state should give up its religious prejudice. Does he, the Jew, give up his religious prejudice? Has he then the right to demand that someone else should renounce his religion? By its very nature, the Christian state is incapable of emancipating the Jew, but, adds Brouwer, by its very nature, the Jew cannot be emancipated. So as long as the state is Christian and the Jew is Jewish, one is incapable of granting emancipation as others is of receiving it. But the Christian state cannot behave towards the Jew only in this way characteristic of the Christian state. That is, by granting privileges, by permitting the separation of the Jew from the other subjects, by making him feel the pressure of all other separate spheres of society, and feel it all the more intensely because he is in religious opposition to the dominant religion. But the Jew, too, can behave towards the state only in a Jewish way, by treating it as something alien to him, by contraposing his imaginary nationality to a real nationality, by contraposing his illusionary law to a real law, by deeming himself justified in separating himself from mankind, by abstaining on principle and taking a part in the historical movement, but by putting his trust in the future, which has nothing in common with the future of mankind in general, and by seeing himself as a member of the Jewish people and the Jewish people as a chosen people. On what grounds, then, do Jews want emancipation? On account of your religion? It is the mortal enemy of the state religion. As citizens, in Germany there are no citizens. As human beings, but you are no more human beings than those to whom you appeal. Brouwer has posed the question of Jewish emancipation in a new form, given a critical analysis of the previous formulations and solutions of the question. What he asks is the nature of the Jew is to be emancipated and of the Christian state that is to emancipate him. He replies by a critique of the Jewish religion, which he analyzes the religious opposition between Judaism and Christianity. He elucidates the essence of the Christian state and he does all this audaciously, trenchantly, wittily, and with profundity, in the style of writing that is precise as it is pithy and vigorous. How then does Brouwer solve the Jewish question? What is the result? The formulation of the question is the solution. The critique of the Jewish question is the answer to the Jewish question. The summary, therefore, is as follows. We must emancipate ourselves before we can emancipate others. The most rigid form of the opposition between Jew and Christian is a religious opposition. And how is this opposition resolved? By making it impossible. How is a religious opposition made impossible? By abolishing religion. As soon as a Jew and Christian recognize their respective religions are no more than different stages in the development of the human mind, we see that stages conception of early Marx here. And we can debate whether or not it remains. I think it mostly does, although there's some things that cut against it. Different snakeskins cast off by history, and the man is the snake who sloughed them. The relation of the Jew and the Christian is no longer religious, but only in a critical scientific and human relation. Science then constitutes their unity, but contradictions in science are resolved by science itself. The German Jew, in particular, is confronted by the general absence of political emancipation and the strongly marked Christian character of the state. In Bauer's conception, however, the Jewish question has universal significance, independent specifically of German conditions. It is a question of the relation of religion to the state, of the contradiction between religious constraint and political emancipation. Emancipation from religion is laid down as a condition both to the Jews who want to be emancipated politically and to the state which is to effect emancipation and is itself to be emancipated. Long quote, I believe, from Bauer. Very well, it is said. The Jew himself says it. The Jew is to be emancipated not as a Jew, not because he is a Jew, but because he possesses such an excellent universal human principle of morality. On the contrary, the Jew will retreat behind the citizen and be a citizen, although he is a Jew and is to remain a Jew. That is to say, he is and remains a Jew, although he is a citizen and lives in universal human conditions. His Jewish and restricted nature triumphs always in the end over his human and political obligations. The prejudice remains in spite of being outstripped by general principles, but if it remains, then on the contrary, it outstrips everything else. Only sophisticatedly, only apparently, would the Jew be able to remain a Jew in the life of the state. Hence, if he wants to remain a Jew, the mere appearance will become essential and would triumph. That is to say, his life in the state will only be a semblance or only temporary exception to the essential and the rule. On the capacity of presenting Jews and Christians to become free. Let us hear, on the other hand, how Bauer presents the task of the state. France, he says, has shown us, Proceedings of the Chamber of Deputies, December 26, 1840, in connection with the Jewish question, just as it had been continually done on all other political questions, the spectacle of life is free, by which revokes its freedom by law, hence declaring it to be an appearance, and on the other hand, contradicting its free law by action, the Jewish question, 1864. And in France, universal freedom is not yet the law, but the Jewish question has not yet been resolved because legal freedom, that is, the fact that all citizens are equal, is restricted in actual life, which is still dominated and divided by religious privileges. The lack of freedom in actual life restricts on the law and compels the latter to sanction the divisions of the citizens who are such free into oppressed and oppressors. When, therefore, would the Jewish question be solved for France? Again, long Bauer quote. The Jews, for example, would have ceased to be Jews if he did not allow himself to be prevented by his law from fulfilling his duties to the state and his fellow citizens. That is, for example, if on Sabbath he attended the Chamber of Deputies and took part in official proceedings. Every religious privilege, and therefore also the monopoly of the privileged church, would be abolished altogether. And if some or many persons, or even the overwhelming majority, still believe themselves to be fulfill religious duties, this fulfillment ought to be left to them as a purely private matter. There is no longer any religion when there's no longer any privileged religion. Take from religion its exclusive power, and it will no longer exist. I'm not sure that's actually true, Bauer, but nonetheless, just as Monsieur Martin de Nord saw the proposal to admit mention of Sunday and the law as the mention to declare Christianity has ceased to exist with equal reason, and with this reason is very well founded, the declaration that the law of the Sabbath is no longer binding on the Jew would be a proclamation abolishing Judaism. Bauer therefore demands on one hand that the Jew should renounce his Judaism and that mankind in general should renounce religion in order to achieve civic emancipation. On the other hand, he is quite consistently regards the political abolition of religion as the abolition of religion as such. The state which presupposes religion is not yet a true real state. Quote, of course, the religious notion affords security to the state, but to what state? To what kind of state? At this point, the one-sided formulation of the Jewish question becomes self-evident. It was by no means sufficient to investigate who is to emancipate, who is to be emancipated. Criticism had to investigate a third point. It is to inquire, what kind of emancipation is in question? What are conditions follow from the very nature of the emancipation that is demanded? Only the criticism of political emancipation itself would have been the conclusive criticism of Jewish question in its real emerging in the general question of the time. Because Bauer does not raise the question to this level, he becomes entangled in contradictions. He puts forward conditions which are not based on the nature of political emancipation itself. He raises questions which are not part of his problem, and he solves problems which leave this question unanswered. When Bauer says of the opponents of Jewish emancipation, their error was only that they assumed that the Christian state to be the only true one and did not subject it to the same criticism that they applied to Judaism. We find that his error lies in the fact that he subjects to criticism only the Christian state and not the state as such, that he does not investigate the relations of political emancipation to human emancipation, and therefore forwards the conditions which can be explained only by uncritical confusion of political emancipation with general human emancipation. If Bauer asks the Jews, have you, from your standpoint, the right to want political emancipation? We can converse ask the question, does the standpoint of political emancipation give the right to the man from the Jews the abolition of Judaism, and from man the abolition of religion? The Jewish question acquires a different form depending on the state in which the Jew lives. In Germany, there is no political state. No state as such. The Jewish question is purely a theological one. The Jew finds himself in religious opposition to the state, which recognizes Christianity as its basis. The state is a theologian ex professo. Criticism here is criticism of theology, a double-edged criticism, criticism of Christian theology and of Jewish theology. Hence, we continue to operate in the sphere of theology, however much we might operate critically within it. In France, a constitutional state, the Jewish question is a question of constitutionalism, the question of the incompleteness of political emancipation, since the semblance of the state religion is retained here, although in a meaningless and self-contradictory formula, that of a religion of the majority. The relation of Jews to the state remains a semblance of a religious theological opposition. Only in North American states, at least in some of them, the Jewish question loses theological significance and becomes really a secular question. Only where the political state exists in completely developed form can the relation of the Jew and of the religious mind in general to the political state, and therefore to the relations of the religion of the state, show itself in its specific character and its purity. The criticism of this relation ceases to be theological criticism as soon as the state ceases to adopt a theological attitude towards religion. As soon as it behaves towards religion as a state, i.e. politically, criticism then becomes criticism of the political state. And at this point, where the question ceases to be theological, Bauer's criticism ceases to be critical. Quote. This is from Bauer. Actually, may not be. In the United States, there is neither a state religion nor religion declared to be that of the majority, nor the predominance of one cult over the other. The state stands aloof of all cults, sort of, but it did it at the federal level. And indeed, there are some North American states where, quote, the Constitution does not impose any religious belief or religious practice as a condition of political rights. See Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, quote, in the United States, people do not believe that a man without religion can be an honest man. Nevertheless, North America is preeminently the country of religiosity, as Beaumont, Tocqueville, and the Englishman Hamilton unanimously assure us. The North American state, however, it's only as an example. The question is, what is the relation of complete political emancipation to religion? If we find, even in the country of complete political emancipation, religion not only exists, but displays a fresh and vigorous vitality, that is a proof that the existence of religion is not in contradiction to the perfection of the state. Thank you, Marx. Since, however, the existence of religion is in the existence of a defect, the source of this defect can only be sought in the nature of the state itself. We can no longer regard religion as the cause, but only as a manifestation of secular narrowness. Therefore, we explain the religious limitations of the free citizen by their secular limitations. We do not assert that they must overcome their religious narrowness in order to get rid of their secular restrictions. We assert that they will overcome their religious narrowness once they get rid of their secular restrictions. We do not turn secular questions into theological ones. History has long enough been merged in superstition. Now we merge superstition in history. The question of the relations of political emancipation to religions becomes for us the question of relations of political emancipation to human emancipation. We criticize the religious weakness of the political state by criticizing the political state in its secular form, apart from its weakness as regards to religion. The contradiction between the state and a particular religion, for instance, Judaism, is given to us a human form, the contradiction between the state and particular secular elements. The contradiction between the state and religion in general as a contradiction between the state and its presuppositions in general. Now, we still haven't got to the Rousseau quote, but we are seeing where this secularization of bourgeois values is found in Marx. Right? That it's a movement of history. We have to go more into that, though. We're going to have to get into what is meant by that. For Hegel, God really is, although manifesting negatively in history, the source of the ultimate idea. And Marx recognizes that, but we'll get to that when we get to the other critiques. The political emancipation of the Jews, the Christians, and in general of religious man is the emancipation of the state from Judaism, from Christianity, and from religion in general. In its own form, in the manner characteristic of its nature, the state as state emancipates itself from religion by emancipating itself from state religion. That is to say, by the state as a state not professing any religion, but on the contrary, asserting itself as a state. The political emancipation from religion is not a religious emancipation that has been carried through to the completion and is free from contradiction, because political emancipation is not the form of human emancipation which has been carried through its completion and is free from contradiction. The limit of political emancipation are evident at once from the fact that the state can free itself from the restriction without man being free from this restriction. The state can be free, it can be a free state, pun on words, free stat, which also means republic, but without being a free man. Bauer himself tactfully admits this when he lays down the following condition for political emancipation. Quote, every religious privilege, and therefore also the monopoly of the privileged church, would have to be abolished altogether. And if some or many portions, or even the overwhelming majority, still believe themselves to be bound by to fulfill religious duties, the fulfillment ought to be left to them as a purely private matter. It is possible, therefore, for the state to have emancipated itself from religion even if the overwhelming majority is still religious. The overwhelming majority does not cease to be religious through being religious in private. But the attitude of the state and of the republic, the free state in particular, to religion is, after all, only an attitude toward religion of men who compose the state. It follows from this that man frees himself through the medium of the state, that he frees himself politically from the limitation when, in contradiction with himself, he raises himself above the limitation in an abstract, limited, and partial way. It follows further that, by freeing himself politically, man frees himself in a roundabout way, through an intermediary, through an essential intermediary. It follows finally that man, even if he proclaims himself to an atheist through the medium of the state, that is, if he complains the state to be atheist, still remains in the grip of religion precisely because he acknowledges himself only by a roundabout route, through an intermediary. Religion is precisely the recognition of man in a roundabout way, through an intermediary. The state is an intermediary between man and man's freedom, just as Christ is the intermediary to whom man transfers the burden of all his divinity, all his religious constraint, so the state is the intermediary to whom man transfers all his non-divinity and all his human unconstraint. The political evaluation of man above religion shares all the defects and all the advantages of the political evaluation and elevation in general. The state as a state annuls, for instance, private property. Man declares by political means that private property is abolished as soon as property qualification for the right to elect or to be elected is abolished, as has occurred in many states in North America. Hamilton quite correctly interprets this fact from the political point of view as meaning, quote, the masses have won victory over property owners and financial wealth. Hamilton, Man and Manners in America. Edinburgh, 1833, page 146. In private polity, property abolished in the idea, if non-property owners have become the legislature for the property owner, the property qualification for suffrage is the last political form of giving recognition to private property. Nevertheless, the political annulment of private property only fails to abolish private property, but even presupposes it. The state abolishes in its own way the distinctions of birth, social rank, education, and occupation when it declares that birth, social rank, education, and occupation are non-political distinctions. When it proclaims without regard to these distinctions that every member of the nation is an equal participant in national sovereignty, when it treats all elements of the real life of the nation from the standpoint of the state. Nevertheless, the state allows private property, education, occupation to act in their way, i.e. private property as education, occupation, and to exert the influence of their special nature. Far from abolishing these real distinctions, the states only exist in the presumption of their existence. It feels itself to be a political state and asserts itself universally only in opposition to the elements of its being. Hegel, therefore, defines the relations of the political state to religion quite correctly when he says, in order that the state should come into existence as a self-knowing moral reality of the mind, its distinction from form of authority and faith is essential. This distinction emerges only insofar as the ecclesiastical aspect arrives at the separation within itself. It is only in this way that the state, above the particular churches, has achieved and brought into existence the universality of thought, which is the principle of its form. Hegel's philosophy of right. Of course, and only in this way, above the particular element, does the state constitute itself as a universality. The perfect political state is, by its nature, man's species life, as opposed to his material life. For clarity's sake, here we go to the Oxford Reference Dictionary. What is species being? A concept employed extensively by Hegelians of Germany in the 1880s and 1840s, used primarily to argue for the absolute uniqueness of man due to man's possession of consciousness. Not just consciousness of self, which other social animals possess, but rather consciousness of species, our essential nature. Hence, man was sui generis in his ability to reflect about his own species and also in his ability to make his own nature an object of thought. The contemplative life was distinctly and exclusively human. Indeed, man was taken to transcend merely an animal individuality and thought, and for some, like Feuerbach, this meant that human individuality was not self-sein, being oneself, but Mitsein, being with another. Marx extended the concept of species being. While he accepted that man was unique, he also believed that this distinctly human attribute was not thought or consciousness per se, but whether free and conscious material production. It is, therefore, free labor which constitutes man's active species life. From the thinker John Holliday. All right. Returning to the text, we have given ourselves a definition of species being. So let's continue here. Nevertheless, the political annulment of private property not only fails to abolish private property, but even presupposes it. The state abolishes in its own way all preconditions of this egotistical life continue to exist in civil society. So let's go back here and look at what is meant in Marx by civil society. So from Marxist.org, civil society in German, Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, or bourgeois society. Now, a lot of people make this distinction of civil society as somehow not bourgeois, and that's a mistranslation, as like somehow civil society is a separate from political society. It kind of is and kind of isn't, but when they remove it from its bourgeois context, they're actually missing what Marx was saying and critiquing simultaneously. So get back into this. All right. Civil society refers to the system of social relations based on the association of people independently of the state and the family, which first emerged in Europe in the 17th century. Civil society is characterized by, quote, free labor and a commodity market, a system of law enforcement and voluntary association. See Engels' discussion of the translation of Bürgerliche Gesellschaft in his letter to Marx on September 23rd of 1852. Middle class society for Bürgerliche Gesellschaft is not strictly grammatically or logically correct. If one were to translate Feudal Gesellschaft as nobility society, an educated Englishman would not say this. He would have to say bourgeois society, or depending on circumstances, commercial or industrial society, to which one might append the following note. By bourgeois society, we understand the phase of social development in which the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the class of the industrial and commercial capitalist, is, socially and politically, the ruling class, which is now the case more or less in all civilized countries of Europe and America. By expression, bourgeois society and industrial and commercial society, we therefore propose to designate the same stage of social development. The first expression referring to, however, the more to the fact of the middle class being the ruling class in opposition to either the class whose rule it superseded, the feudal nobility, the old elite class, the ancien regime, are those classes which it succeeds in keeping under its social and political dominion. The proletariat are the industrial working class, the rural populations, etc., etc. While these designations of commercial and industrial society more particularly bear upon the mode of production and distribution characteristics of this phase in social history, aka bourgeois society, is the society produced by capitalism. It precedes it, but also is it. All right. Early bourgeois thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes, Omni Bellum Omni, War of All Against All, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which we're going to get to in a minute, generally saw civil society as expressing human nature and tried to work out how it could be managed to avoid catastrophe. It was Hegel who showed in his philosophy of right that it was the growth of civil society which was the most characteristic feature of modern society, in contrast to medieval society, in which the state was inseparable from the kinship system, which determined the station of every person in life and their occupation. Hegel saw civil society as expressing the work of the idea, capital I, behind the backs of the people who govern by forces which they were unconscious, like Adam Smith's invisible hand, except here he means literally God. Whereas he saw the state as a self-conscious actualization of reason, also from God. Hegel promoted the separation of the state from civil society, arguing, as many were later to argue, that the state had no business interfering in the economy. After his early critique of Hegel's political theory, Marx did not use this concept. Take that, politicos, because who uses civil society a lot more than they seem to, because it tended to obscure the more fundamental relations between the superstructure and relations of production. Nowadays, the term civil society is sometimes used to refer to activity that is outside the domains of both state and capital, sometimes to strengthening of the rule of law, sometimes to refer to the development of voluntary associations of independent commercial relations. So is Marx celebrating bourgeois society? Is Marx saying that bourgeois society is separate from its political and also capital manifestations? Doesn't seem to be from the note we just read. And Engels' note on the meaning of bourgeois society. Also seems like Marx does change his usage here, and that's not just an Althusserian presupposition. But let's get back into the text. All the preconditions of egotistic life continue to exist in civil society outside the spirit of state, but as qualities of civil society, whereas the political state has attained its true development, man, not only in thought and consciousness, but in reality and life, leads a twofold life, a heavenly and an earthly life in the political community, which he considers himself to be a communal being, and life in civil society, in which he acts as a private individual, regards other men as his means, degrades himself into means, and becomes a plaything of alien powers. That hardly sounds like a valorization of civil society or the state. Anyway, that was me talking, by the way. The relation of the political state to civil society is just as spiritual as the relations of heaven to earth. The political state stands in the same opposition to civil society, and it prevails over the latter in the same way religion prevails over the narrowness of the secular world, i.e., by likewise having to acknowledge it, to restore it, and to allow itself to be dominated by it. In his most immediate reality, in civil society, man is a secular being. Here, he regards himself as a real individual, and so is regarded by others. He is a fictitious phenomenon. In the state, on the other hand, where man is regarded as a species being, he is an imaginary member of an illusionary sovereign, and is deprived of his real individual life and is endowed with unreal universality, aka the unreal universality of bourgeois right, which Marx seeks to make real. That is Cutrone's point, and it is a valid reading of Marx. Anyway, man, as an inherent of a particular religion, finds himself in conflict with the citizen and with other members of that community. This conflict reduces itself to secular division between political state and civil society. For man as a bourgeois, as a member of civil society, bourgeois society in German, life in the state is only a semblance or a temporary exception to the essential and the rule. Of course, the bourgeois, like the Jew, remains only sophisticatedly in the spirit of political life, just as a citizen in French, participant in political life, is only sophisticatedly remains a Jew or a bourgeois. But this sophistry is not personal. It is a sophistry of the political state itself. The difference between the merchant and the citizen, the Staatsbürger, between the day laborer and the citizen, between the landowner and the citizen, between the merchant and the citizen, between the living individual and the citizen. This is a contradiction in which religious man finds himself with political man, is in the same contradiction in which a bourgeois finds himself with the citoyen, and a member of a society in which his political lions skin. This secular conflict, to which the Jewish question ultimately reduces itself, the relation between the political state and its preconditions, whether these are material elements, such as private property, or spiritual elements, such as culture or religion, the conflict between the general interest and the private interest, the schism between the political state and civil society. This secular antithesis Bauer allows to persist, whereas he conducts a polemic against a religious expression. Quote, it is precisely on the basis of civil society that need ensures the continuance of this society and guarantees its necessity, which exposes its existence to continual dangers, maintains its elements of uncertainty, and produces that continually shaping mixture of poverty and riches, of distress and prosperity, and brings about change in general. Compare the whole section, civil society, which is drawn up on the basic line of Hegel's philosophy of law. Civil society, in opposition to political state, is recognized as necessity because the political state is recognized as a necessity. Political emancipation is, of course, a big step forward. True, but it is not the final form of human emancipation in general. But it is the final form of human emancipation within the hitherto existing world order. It goes without saying that we are speaking here of real, practical emancipation. Man emancipates himself politically from religion by banishing it from the sphere of public law to that of private law. Religion is no longer the spirit of the state in which man behaves, although in a limited way, in a particular form, in a particular sphere, as a species being in community with other men. Religion has become the spirit of civil society, of the spirit of egoism, of bellum omnium contra omnes. It is no longer the essence of the community, but the essence of difference. It has become the expression of man's separation from his community, from himself, and from other men, as it was originally. It is only the abstract avowal of specific perversity, private whimsy, and arbitrariness. The endless fragmentation of religion in North America, for example, gives it even externally the form of a purely individual affair. It has thus been thrust upon the multitude of private interests and ejected from the community as such. But one should be under no illusion about the limits of political emancipation. The division of the human being into public man and private man, the displacement of religion from the state into civil society, this is not a stage of political emancipation, but its completion. The emancipation, therefore, neither abolishes the real religiousness of man, nor strives to do so. Take that, Bauer. But we haven't gotten to the point that Cutrone was trying to make, although this is where the secularization of bourgeois white probably comes from Cutrone. Not the other. It's also implied in that other section of the philosophical and economic manuscripts in early Marx. We are very much in early Marx territory in all these references here, and we do have to deal with that. But for right now, we're going to continue with what Cutrone told us to read. So let's get back to us. The decomposition of man into a Jew and a citizen, Protestant and a citizen, religious man and a citizen, is neither the exception directed against citizenhood, nor is it a circumvention of political emancipation. It is political emancipation itself, the political method of emancipating oneself from religion. Of course, in the period when the political state as such is born violently out of civil society, when political liberation is a form in which men strive to achieve their liberation, the state can and must go so far as the abolition of religion, the destruction of religion. But it can do so only in the same way it proceeds to abolish private property, to the maximum, to confiscation, to progressive taxation, just as far as it goes with the abolition of life, the guillotine. At times, the special self-confidence, political life ceases to impress its prerequisite, civil society, and the elements composing that society, and it constitutes itself as a real species being a man, devoid of contradictions. But it can achieve this only by coming into violent contradiction with its own conditions of life, only by declaring revolution to be permanent, and therefore the political drama necessarily ends with the reestablishment of religion, private property, and all the elements of civil society, just as war ends with peace. Indeed, the perfect Christian state is not the so-called Christian state, which acknowledges Christianity as its basis, as a state religion, and therefore adopts as an exclusive attitude towards other religions. On the contrary, the perfect Christian state is an atheistic state, the democratic state, the state which regulates religion to a place amongst the other elements of civil society. The state is still theological, which still officially professes Christianity as its creed, but does not dare to proclaim itself as a state, has in reality as a state not yet succeeded in expressing the human basis, of which Christianity is a high-flown expression in a secular human form. The so-called Christian state is simply nothing more than a non-state, since it is not Christianity as a religion, but only the human background of the Christian religion, which one can find expression in actual human creations. The so-called Christian state is a Christian negation of the state, but by no means a political realization of Christianity. The state still professes Christianity in the form of religion, does not yet profess it in the form appropriate to the state, for it still has a religious attitude towards religion. That is to say, it is not the true implementation of the human basis of religion, because it still relies on the unreal imaginary form of the human core. The so-called Christian state is an imperfect state. The Christian religion is regarded by it as a supplementation and sanctification of its imperfection. For the Christian state, therefore, religion is necessarily becomes a means. Hence, it is a hypocritical state. It makes a great difference whether the complete state, because of the defect inherent in the general nature of the state, counts religion among its presuppositions, or whether it is an incomplete state because the defect inherent in a particular existence as a defective state declares the religion as its basis. In the latter case, religion becomes an imperfect politics. In the former case, the imperfection even of consummate politics becomes evident in religion. The so-called Christian state needs the Christian religion in order to complete itself as a state. The democratic state, the real state, does not need religion for a political implementation. On the contrary, it can disregard religion because it is the human basis of religion in a realized secular manner. The so-called Christian state, on the other hand, has a real political attitude towards religion and religious attitude towards politics. By degrading the forms of the state to mere semblance, it equally degrades religion to mere semblance. Ouch. But not relevant yet. All right. In order to make this contradiction clearer, let us consider Barr's projection of the Christian state, a projection based on his observation of the Christian German state. Quote, Barr. Recently, said Barr, in order to prove the impossibility of the non-existence of a Christian state, references have been frequently made to those saying in the gospel, which the present-day state not only does not comply, but cannot possibly comply if it does not want to dissolve itself completely as a state. But the matter cannot be disposed of so easily, because what do these gospels sayings demand? Supernatural renunciation of the self, submission to authority of revelation, turning away from the state, the abolition of secular conditions. Well, the Christian state demand and accomplishes all of that. It has assimilated the spirit of the gospel, and if it does not reproduce this spirit in the same terms as the gospel, that occurs only because it expresses the spirit in political forms, i.e. in forms which, it is true, are taken from the political system in the world, which the religious rebirth would have to undergo, becomes degraded to mere semblances, and thus the turning away from the state while making the political forms for its realization. Bauer then explains that the people of a Christian state is only a non-people, no longer having a will of its own, but whose true existence lies in the leader to whom it is subjected, although the leader, by his origins and nature, is alien to it, i.e. given by God and imposed on the people without any cooperation on its part. Bauer declares that the laws of such people are not their own creation, but are actual revelations, that its supreme chief needs privileged intermediaries with the people in a strict sense, with the masses, and that the masses themselves are divided into a multitude of particular groupings which are formed and determined by chance, which are differentiated by their interests, their particular passions and prejudices, and obtain permission as a privilege to isolate themselves from one another. However, Bauer himself says, politics, if it be nothing but religion, ought to not be politics, just as the cleaning of saucepans, if it is accepted as a religious manner, ought to not be regarded as a matter of domestic economy. In the Christian German state, however, religion is an economic matter, just as economic matters belong to the sphere of religion. The domination of religion in the Christian German state is the religion of domination. The separation of the spirit of the Gospels from the letter of the Gospels is an irreligious act, a state which makes the Gospel speak in the language of politics, that is, in another language than that of the Holy Ghost, commits sacrilege, if not in human eyes, then in the eyes of its own religion. The state which acknowledges Christianity as its supreme criterion and the Bible as its charter must be confronted with the words of the Holy Scripture, for every word of the Scripture is holy. The state, which is as well as the human rubbish on which it is based, is caught in a painful contradiction that is insoluble from the standpoint of religious consciousness when it is referred to those gospel sayings, when it referred to those sayings of the gospel, which Not only does one not comply, but one cannot possibly comply if one does not want to dissolve itself completely as a state. And why does it not want to dissolve itself completely? The state itself cannot give an answer to either to itself or to others. In its own consciousness, the official Christian state is an imperative, the realization of which is unattainable. The state can easily assert the reality of existence only by lying to itself, and therefore always remains in its own eyes an object of doubt, an unreliable, problematic object. Criticism is therefore fully justified in forcing the state that relies on the Bible into mental derangement, in which it no longer knows whether it is an illusion or reality, in which the infamy of its secular aim, for which the religion serves as a cloak, comes into insoluble conflict with the sincerity of religious consciousness, for which every religion appears as the aim of the world. This state can only save itself from its inner torment if it becomes a police agent of the Catholic Church. In relation to the Church, which declares the secular power to be its servant, the state is powerless. The secular power, which claims to be the rule of the religious spirit, is powerless. It is indeed estrangement which matters to the so-called Christian state, but not man. The only man who counts, the king, is a being specifically different from other men, and is, moreover, a religious being directly linked with heaven and with God. The relationship which prevails here are still relationships dependent on faith. The religious spirit, therefore, is still not really secularized. But, furthermore, the religious spirit cannot be really secularized, for it is itself but the non-secular form of a stage in the development of the human mind. The religious spirit can not only be secularized insofar as a stage of development of the human mind, of which it is a religious expression, makes its appearance and becomes constituted in a secular form, thus takes place in a democratic state. Not Christianity, but the human basis of Christianity is the basis of the state. Religion remains ideal. Non-secular consciousness of its members, because the religion is the ideal form of the state of development, has achieved in this state. The members of the political state are religious owing to the dualism between individual life and species life, between the life of civil society and political life. They are religious because men treat political life of the state, an area beyond their real individuality, as if it were their true life. They are religious insofar as religion here is the spirit of civil society, expressing the separation and remoteness of man from man. Political democracy is Christian, since in it man, not merely one man, but every man, ranks as sovereign, as the highest being, but it is man in his uncivilized, unsocial form, man in his fortuitous existence, man just as he is, man as he has been corrupted by the whole organization of our society, who has lost himself, been alienated, and handed over to the rule of inhuman conditions and elements. In short, a man who is not yet a real species being, which is a creation of a fantasy, a dream, a postulate of Christianity, i.e. the sovereignty of man, but man as an alien being different from the real man, becomes a democracy, tangible reality, present existence, and a secular principle. In a perfect democracy, the religious and theological consciousness itself is in its own eyes the more religious and the more theological, because it is apparently without political significance, without worldly aims, the concern of disposition that shuns the world, the expression of the intellectual narrow-mindedness, the product of arbitrariness and fantasy, and it is a life that is really of other worlds. Of the other world. Christianity attains here a practical expression of its universal religious significance, and in the most diverse world outlooks are grouped alongside it in the form of Christianity, and still more because it does not require other people to profess Christianity, but only religion in general, any kind of religion. See Beaumont's work quoted above. The religious consciousness revels in the wealth of religious contradictions and religious diversity. We have thus shown the political emancipation for religion leaves religion in existence, although not a privileged religion. The contradiction in which the adherent of a particular religion finds himself involved in relation to his citizenship is only one aspect of the universal secular contradiction between the political state and civil society. The consummation of the Christian state is a state which acknowledges itself as a state and thus disregards the religion of its members. The emancipation of the state from religion is not emancipation of real man from religion. Therefore, we do not say to the Jews, as Bauer does, you cannot be emancipated politically without emancipating yourself radically from Judaism. On the contrary, we tell them, because you can be emancipated politically without renouncing Judaism completely and incontrovertibly, political emancipation is not itself human emancipation. If you Jews want to be emancipated politically without emancipating yourself humanely, Half-hearted the approach, and contradiction is not in you alone, is inherent in the nature and category of political emancipation. If you find yourself within the confines of this category, you shall in general confinement. Just as the state evangelizes, when it as the state, it adopts a Christian attitude towards Jews, the Christian acts politically when, although Jews, he demands civic rights. But if man, although a Jew, can be emancipated politically and receive civic rights, he can lay claim to the so-called rights of man and receive them. Bauer denies this. Quote, the question is whether the Jew as such, that is, the Jew who himself admits that he is compelled by his own true nature to live permanently in separation from other men, is capable of receiving universal rights of man and of conceding them to others. For the Christian world, the idea of the rights of man was only discovered in the last century. It is not innate in men. On the contrary, it is gained only in the struggle against the historical traditions in which hitherto man is brought up. Thus, the rights of man are not gifts of nature, not a legacy from past history, but the renewal of the struggle against the accident of birth and against the privileges to which up to now have been handed down from generation to generation. These rights are the results of culture, and the only one who has earned and deserved them can possess them. Can the Jew really take possession of them? As long as he's a Jew, the restricted nature which makes him a Jew is bound up to triumph over the human nature which linked him a man with other men, and will separate him from non-Jews. He declares by this separation the particular nature which makes him a Jew is his true, highest nature, before which the human nature gives away. Similarly, the Christian as a Christian cannot grant the rights of man. According to Bauer, man has to sacrifice the privilege of faith to be able to receive the universal rights of man. Let us examine for a moment the so-called rights of man. So-called rights of man. I want to come back to that. We've talked a lot about bourgeois right here as a good. To be precise, the rights of man are their authentic form, in the form in which they ought to be, in which they have been. I'm going to reread that. In the form which they have amongst those who discovered them, the North Americans and the French. So they do exist for Marx. They're discovered. Okay. These rights of man are in part political rights, which can only be exercised in the community with others. Their content is a participation in the community, and specifically in the political community in the life of the state. They come within the category of political freedom. The category of civic rights, which, as we have seen, in no way presupposes the uncontroversial and positive abolition of religion, nor therefore of Judaism. And there remains to be examined the other parts of the rights of man, the droits de l'homme, insofar as they differ from the droits des citoyens, including among the freedom of conscience, the right to practice any religion one chooses. The privilege of faith is expressly recognized either as right of man or as a consequence of the right of man, that of liberty. Quote, this is from Beaumont. Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, 1791, Article 10. No one is to be subjected to annoyance or harassment, I guess, because of his opinions, even religious opinions. The freedom of every man to practice the religion of which he is an adherent. Declaration of Rights of Man, 1973, includes among the rights of man Article 7, the free exercise of religion, and indeed to regard to man's right to express his thoughts and opinions, to hold meetings, and to exercise his religion, as even stated. The necessity of proclaiming these rights presupposes the existence or the recent memory of despotism. Compared to the Constitution of 1795, the Constitution of Pennsylvania, all men have received from nature the imprescriptible right to worship the Almighty according to the dictates of their conscience, and no one can be legally compelled to follow, establish, or support against his will any religion or religious ministry. No human authority can, in any circumstances, intervene in the matter of conscience or control the forces of the soul. Constitution of New Hampshire, Article 5 and 6. Among the natural rights, some are by nature inalienable, since no thing can replace them. The right of conscience are among them. Incompatibility between religion and the rights of man is to such a degree absent from the concepts of the rights of man that, on the contrary, man's right to be religious in the way he chooses and to practice his own particular religion is expressly included in the rights of man. The privilege of faith is a universal right of man. The droits de l'homme, the rights of man, as such, are distinct from the droits du citoyen, the right of the citizens. Who is the homme as distinct from the citizen? Who is the man as distinct from the citizen? Who is the homme as distinct from the citoyen? No other than the member of civil society. Why is a member of civil society called man? Simply man. Why are his rights the rights of man? How is this fact to be explained? From the relationship between the political state and civil society, and from the nature of political emancipation. Above all, we note that the fact of the so-called rights of man, the droits de l'homme, as distinct from the droits du citoyen, I think, are nothing but the rights of the members of civil society, i.e., the rights of egotistical man, a man separated from other men and from community. Let us hear what the most radical constitution, the Constitution of 1793, has to say. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, Article 2. These rights are natural and imprescriptible rights, are equality, liberty, security, and property. What constitutes liberty? Article 6. Liberty is the power which man has to do everything that does not harm the rights of others. Or according to the Declaration of Rights of Man of 1791, I can't read. Liberty consists in being able to do everything which does not harm others. Do what thy wilt be the whole of the law, except for don't harm others or something. Liberty, therefore, is the right to do everything that harms no one else. The limits within which anyone can act without harming someone else are defined by law. Just as the boundary between two fields is determined by the boundary post. It is a question of liberty of man as an isolated monad withdrawn to himself. Why is the Jew, according to Bauer, incapable of the rights of man? So long as he's a Jew, the restricted nature which he makes himself a Jew is bound to triumph over the human nature which should link him as men with other men and will separate him from non-Jews. But the rights of man to liberty is not based on the association of man with man, but on the separation of man from man. It is the right of this separation, the right of restricted individual, which he withdraws into himself. The practical application of man's right to liberty is man's right to private property. But what constitutes man's right to private property? Article 16, Constitution of 1793, the right of private property, in which every citizen has of enjoying and disposing at his discretion of his goods and income, of the fruits of his labor and industry. The right of man to private property is, therefore, the right to enjoy one's property and to dispose of it at the discretion, without regard to other men, independently of society, the right of self-interest. This individual liberty and its application from the form and basis of civil society. It makes every man see other men, not the realization of his own freedom, but the barrier to it. But above all, it proclaims the right of man, quote, of enjoying and of disposing at his discretion of his goods and income, of the fruits of his labor and industry. There remain the other rights of man, equality and sororité, so equality and security. Equality is used here in a non-political sense. It's nothing but the equality of liberty described above. Namely, each man is to the same extent regarded as a self-sufficient monad. The Constitution of 1795 defines the concept of equality in accordance with this significance as follows. Article 3. Equality consists in the law being the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. And what security? Article 8. Constitution of 1793. Security consists in protection afforded by society to each of its members for the preservation of his person, his rights, and his property. Security is the highest social concept of civil society, the concept of police, expressing the fact that the whole of society exists only in order to guarantee to each of its individual members the preservation of his person, his rights, and his property. It is in this sense that Hegel calls civil society the state of need and reason. The concept of security does not raise civil society above its egoism. On the contrary, security is the insurance of egoism. None of the so-called rights of man, therefore, go beyond egoistic man, beyond man as a member of civil society. That is, as an individual drawn to himself, into the confines of his private interest and his private caprice, and separated from the community. And the rights of man, he is far from being conceived as a species being. On the contrary, species life itself, society, appears as a framework external to individuals, as a restriction on their original independence. Hence the atomization. The sole bond holding them together is natural necessity, need and private interest, the preservation of their property and their egoistic selves. It is puzzling enough that people, which is just beginning to liberate itself, to tell on all barriers between its various sections and to establish a political community, that such people solemnly proclaims, the Declaration of 1791, that the rights of egotistic man separated from his fellow man and from the community. That indeed it repeats its proclamation at the moment only when the most heroic devotion can save the nation, and is therefore imperatively called on, for at the very moment when the sacrifice of all self-interest of civil society must be the order of the day, and egoism must be punished as a crime. the Declaration of Rights of Man, etc. of 1793. This fact becomes more puzzling when we see the political emancipator go so far as to reduce the citizen and the political community to a mere means for maintaining the so-called rights of man. That, therefore, the citoyen is declared to be the servant of the egoistic homme. The sphere in which man acts as a communal being is degraded to the level below the sphere in which he acts as a partial being. And finally, it is not man as citoyen, citizen, but man as private individual, bourgeois, who is considered to be the essential and true man. Hardly sounds like an endorsement of bourgeois society, but nonetheless. The aim of all political associations is preservation of natural and prescribable rights of man. Declaration of Rights of Man, 1791, Article 2. Government institution is instituted in order to guarantee man the enjoyment of his natural and imperceptible rights. Declaration of Rights of Man of 1793, Article 1. Hence, in the moment when the enthusiasm has all the freshness of youth and is intensified to the extreme degree by the force of circumstances, political life declares itself to be a mere means, whose purpose is the life of civil society. Is it true that its revolutionary practice in favorite contradiction with this theory, whereas, for the example, security is declared to be one of the rights of man, violation of private property of correspondence is openly declared to be the order of the day, whereas the unlimited freedom of the press, Constitution of 1793, Article 122, is guaranteed as a consequence of the right of man to individual liberty, freedom of press is totally destroyed, because the freedom of the press should not be permitted when it endangers public life. Robespierre Jean, Histoire pendant the Révolution Française by Boucher-Rose, volume 28, page 159. That is to say, therefore, the right of man to liberty ceases to be a right as soon as it comes in conflict with political life. Whereas, in theory, political life is only to guarantee human rights, the rights of the individual, and therefore must be abandoned as soon as it comes in contradiction with the aim, which is the rights of man. But in practice, this is merely an exception. The theory is the rule. But even if one to regard revolutionary practice as a correct presentation of the relationship, there would still remain the puzzle of why the relationship was turned upside down in the minds of the political emancipators, and the aim appears as means, whereas the means appears as the aim. The optical illusion of their consciousness still remains a puzzle, now a psychological, a theoretical puzzle. The puzzle is easily solved. Political emancipation is at the same time the delusion of the old society on which the state had alienated from the people the sovereign power is based. What was the character of the old society? It can be described in one word: feudalism. The character of the old civil society was directly political. That is to say, the elements of civil life, for example, property or family or the mode of labor, were raised to the level of political elements and life of the form of the signori, the estates, and corporations. In this form, they determine the relation of the individual to the state as a whole, i.e. his political relation, that is, his relations of separation and exclusion from the other components of society. For that organization of national life does not raise property or labor to the level of social elements. On the contrary, it is their complete separation from the state as a whole, and constitute them as discrete societies within society. Thus, the vital functions and conditions of civil rights remained political, although political in the feudal sense, that is to say, they secluded in the individual from the state as a whole, and they converted the particular relation of his corporation to the state as a whole into his general relation to the life of the nation, just like converted the particular civil activity and situation into his general activity and situation. As a result of this organization, the unity of the state, and also the consciousness, will, and activity of this unity, the general power of the state are likewise bound to appear as a particular affair of the ruler and of his servants isolated from the people. The political revolution which overthrew this sovereign power and raised the state affairs to become the sets of the affairs of the people, which constituted the political state as a matter of general concern, that is, as real state, necessarily smashed all the estates, corporations, guilds, and privileges, since they were all manifestations of the separation of the people from the community. The political revolution thereby abolished the political character of civil society. It broke up civil society into single component parts. On one hand, the individuals; on the other hand, the material and spiritual elements constituting the content of life and the social position of these individuals. It set free the political spirit, which had been, as it were, split up, partitioned, and dispersed amongst various blind alleys of feudal society. It gathered the dispersed parts of the political spirit, freed from their intermixture with civil life, and established it as a sphere of the community, the general concern of the nation, ideally independent of those particular elements of civil life. A person's distinct activity and distinct situation in life were reduced to merely individual significance. They no longer constituted the general relations of the individual to the state as a whole. Public affairs as such, on the other hand, became general affairs of each individual, and the public function became the individual's general function. But the completion of this idealism of the state, at the same time, the completion of materialism in civil society, throwing off the political yoke meant at the same time throwing off the bonds which constrained the egotistic spirit of civil society. Political emancipation was, at the same time, the emancipation of civil society from politics, from having the semblance of universal content. Feudal society was resolved into its basic elements. Man, but man has really formed its basis, egotistic man. This man, the member of civil society, is thus the basis, precondition of the political state. He is recognized as such by the state and the rights of man. The liberty of egotistic man, and the recognition of this liberty, however, is rather the recognition of unrestrained movement of the spiritual and material elements from which form the content of his life. Hence, man is not freed from religion, he is received religious freedom. He is not freed from property, he has received freedom to own property. He is not freed from his egotism of business, he's received freedom to engage in business. The establishment of a political state and the dissolution of civil society into independent individuals whose relation with one another depend on law, just as relations of men in the systems of estates and guilds depend on privilege, is accomplished by one and the same act. Man, as a member of civil society, a political man, inevitably appears, however, as natural man. The rights of man appear as natural rights because conscious activity is concentrated on political act. Egotistical man is passive result of a dissolved society, a result that is simply found in existence, an object of immediate certainty, therefore a natural object. Political revolution resolves civil life into component parts without revolutionizing these components themselves or subjecting them to criticism. It regards civil society, bourgeois society, remember, the world of needs, labor, private interest, civil law, as the basis of its existence, as a precondition, not requiring further substantiation, and therefore as its natural basis. Finally, man as a member of civil society is held to be man in the proper sense, homme as distinct from citoyen. And he is man in his sensuous individual immediate existence, whereas political man is only abstract, artificial man, man is allegorical, juridical person. The real man is recognized only in the shape of the egotistical individual. The true man is recognized only in the shape of the abstract citizen. Therefore, Rousseau correctly described the abstract idea of political man as follows. Now we're at the part that Cutrone quoted. And we're going to stop here because I'm not going to read the second part. Whoever dares to undertake the establishment of people's institutions must feel himself capable of changing, as if it were human nature, of transforming each individual, whom by himself is complete and solitary whole, into a part of a larger whole, from which, in a sense, the individual receives his life and his being, of submitting a limited and mental existence for the physical and independent existence. He has to take from man his own powers, and give man in exchange alien powers which he cannot employ without the help of other men. All emancipation is a reduction of the human world in relationship to man himself. Political emancipation is a reduction of man on one hand to a member of civil society, bourgeois society, again, remember, same thing, to an egotistical, independent individual, and on the other hand to citizen, a juridical person. Only when the real individual man reabsorbs himself in the abstract citizen, and as an individual man becomes a species being in his everyday life, in his particular work, in his particular situation, only when he is recognized and organized his own power as social powers, and consequently no longer separates social power from himself in the shape of political power, only then will human emancipation be accomplished. Now, what does Cutrone say about this? Let us go back to Cutrone's response. On Marxist Bonapartism, the dictatorship of the proletariat was supposed to be an expression of the same necessity that brings about Bonapartism and capitalism, its transformation and overcoming. Bonapartism is not the transformation and overcoming of capitalism. It's a regression of capitalism. But the emancipation, it is the inability of the bourgeois order to maintain itself. And I don't want to go back into Brumaire, where you really get the only real substantive discussion of Bonapartism and Marx, but that's pretty clear. So there is a dialectical antithesis between the Bonapartism of the capitalist state and the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, yeah, but the Bonapartism of the capitalist state does not necessarily bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat in the suspension of sovereign exception. It actually brings about the tension between the rule of order and the progress of capitalist development, where we see a return to older forms of political life to stabilize the unstable forms of civil life or a bourgeois society itself. Now, that may prompt the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that it may prompt initial political response that has to assert itself as a state which seeks to abolish itself. That's not in this early Marx stuff. That's kind of a development that develops over time. In general, the dictatorship of the proletariat is really only comes about in the class struggle in France, is where it's first talked about, which is stuff that was written concurrently in 1848 to 1850. It is refined in debates with Blanqui, at least according to Draper, in the 1870s in the course of the First International. The relationship to Bonapartism is thus implied to be there, but I'm not quite sure I know what it is, and I'm not quite sure what specific text Cutrone is pulling from. Okay, let's go into the other thing that I was snarky about. All right. A lot of your remarks depend... This is from... Slave to the Given, which I was snarky to. A lot of your remarks depend on the idea that Wright's pre-existing law depends on natural law theory. Well, it actually says so even in the text I just read, which in turn depends on unjustified theological grounds. Yes, although they're secularized in Marx, we've already talked about that. But the bourgeois right, as articulated in both Kant and Hegel, does not depend on theological grounds, and I think that's wrong. Bourgeois right and Kant and Hegel do depend on theological grounds. It's just theology manifested negatively or as a categorical imperative of reason. They are still theological. We'll get back to that. But nor do they lapse into positivism. Their theory rests on reason as immanent self-reflection. Yes, but immanent from what? It is not immanent from self-reflection itself. It is not immanent from the human. It is immanent from the idea, which is beyond the human. The human accords himself of that in freedom. But it is not purely speculation. It's not pure contemplation in either Hegel or in Kant. We'll get to that. For Kant, this is a priori. Transcendental reasoning is a concept of freedom. Arguably, though this is contentious, grounded in the categorical imperative. This is taken up in the formal proceduralism of Rawls, although neither is a natural law nor a positivist. No, Rawls is a deontological utilitarian who is trying to find another way to ground this right. And he can't do it alone with Kant because Kant has a theological presupposition. It's just that Kant no longer thinks that God can operate by divine revelation because there's too many different divine revelations. So there must be a universal based judgment from which we can derive these bourgeois freedoms and also Christian culture, etc., etc., etc. For Hegel, it is an immanent unfolding of nature of the spirit as understood as self-determining. These rights are articulated in the abstract right, though insufficient on their own and requiring concrete embodiment in ethical life and the laws of the state. Nonetheless, they pre-exist law as rationally presupposed by the very idea of freedom. They're not rationally presupposed by the very idea of freedom. They're rationally presupposed by the very idea of the absolute idea, which is manifest in the spirit of the age, which is God. You cannot remove Hegel from his theological context. And Marx himself is very clear about this, which is why he says what I'm about to read I'm saying. They nonetheless rationally presuppose the idea of freedom, as Cutrone clearly thinks that Kant and more so Hegel expresses the highest point of the bourgeoisie consciousness. Strange you omit this. Well, it doesn't have a lot of relevance to the American conception of rights, even as quoted on the Jewish question, because as clearly emancipated, there's a deistic conception, and both state constitutions of New Hampshire and of Pennsylvania, of which is being invoked. Natural law presupposed on some divine order, which is some way conscious or theological, is presupposed in those constitutional breaks, which in of itself, as Marx points out, separates religion from the state. I think you need to go back and read that closely. But to get to where I want to get here, Marx as a Hegelian. What does Marx think that means? Well, we're now going to go into some short readings to help this out. And they're from different periods of Marx's life. So let's get into that. Let us proceed now to another late Marx work. This is from 1873. This is a very brief afterword to the second German edition of Capital Volume 1. And I want to talk about it a little bit because it clarifies how late Marx thought about this. This is the turning Hegel on its head thing, but it goes into what is meant here. Quote, whilst the writer pictures what he takes to be actually my method, it is striking, and so far as concerns my own application of it, generous way, what else is he picturing but the dialectical method? Of course, the method of presentation must differ in the form from that of inquiry. The latter has the appropriate material and detail, and to analyze the different forms of development, to trace out their interconnections. Only after this work is done can the actual movement be adequately described. If it is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is ideally reflected as in a mirror, then it may appear as if we had before us an a priori construction. My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but it is its direct opposite. To Hegel, the life process of the human brain, i.e. the process of thinking, under the name of the idea, he even transformed unto an independent subject, is the demiurgos of the real world, and the real world is only the external phenomenal form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the idea is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind, and thus into forms of thought. The mystifying side of the Hegelian dialectic I criticized nearly 30 years ago. We were reading it at many other places, at a time when it was still in fashion. But just as I was working at the first volume of Das Kapital, it was the good pleasure of a peevish, arrogant, mediocre epigonoi, who is now talk large in cultured Germany, to treat Hegel in the same way as the brave Moses Mendelssohn in Lessing's time treated Spinoza, i.e. as a dead dog. I therefore avowed myself to be a pupil of that mighty thinker, and even here and there, in a chapter on theory of value, coquetted with the modes of expression particular to him. The mystification which the dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. Now, of course, Cutrone likes this quote. He knows it. He talks about the rational kernel a lot. In its mystified form, the dialectic became a fashion in Germany because it seemed to transfigure and to glorify the existing state of things. In its rational form, it is a scandal and abomination to the bourgeoisdom and its doctrinaire professors, because it includes in its comprehension and affirmation the recognition of the existing state of things, and at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because in regards to every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature no less than its momentary existence, because lets nothing impose upon on it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. The contradictions inherent in the movement of capitalist society impress themselves upon the practical bourgeoisie most strikingly in the changes of the periodic cycle, though which modern industry runs and whose crowning point is the universal crisis. The crisis is once again approaching, although yet as but is in preliminary stage, but by the university of his theater and the intensity of his action, it will drum dialectics into the heads of the mushroom upstarts of the new, holy Prusso-German Empire. So Hegel's form is not to be rejected, but his content is, and so much that his content was a mystification and a theologification of what he could have explained historically by the movement of history in and of itself. Hegel does not get you around the theological nature of liberal conceptions, but it does point to something beyond that theological nature when added to materialist conceptions of history. So Marx is responding to and emergent from Hegelianism, and in that way he is a Hegelian, but he's also emerging and separate from it, and thus is not quite the right way to state what Marx is doing. Similarly, capitalism and socialism are intimately related, but to say they are the same thing is too simple. Now, as regards to the rest of the Why Not Trump article, we have a whole lot of other problems. These are more fundamental problems to deal with. And I am not saying they're all self-apparent. That's why I read, good God, 3 major sections of Marx text today in entirety, so you can contextualize them for yourself. And you need to read all of them on your own. I will put all the links in the show note, and hopefully Cutrone will reply as he sees fit. But we're not going to continue this forever until I get, I'm going to save my next response until another article. I just sat down and started compiling all this and checking all the references, which I do often. If you are in the Patreon, I do this a lot where I go and check references. And I got to give Cutrone credit. I'm not catching him doing what I've caught some other Marxists doing, where they're citing secondary sources and are putting the Marx quote only in context of the secondary sources. And when you check the primary sources, the secondary sources they're citing are reading them in a particularistic way that is not the only justified reading. Now, I am also saying that I don't know that Cutrone's reading is the only justified reading, but it is a reading. Is it true? Those are 2 separate questions. The Marxology and the truth is different things. Marxology tells us what Marx thought, at what period he thought it, and how we come up with a hermeneutic for what we value and not value. The truth is more than that. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. I don't have anything else to say. I've spent too much time on this already. I will go into a cycle of discussion soon about the debates between the CPGB Provisional Committee, aka the people at the Weekly Worker, and Chris Cutrone, both on Lukács and the nature of platypus and the nature of social republicanism, as I also continue my readings of Bordiga. And I'm going to be doing other stuff, like talking about more contemporary stuff like the rot economy, some things that conservatives are on about that we really need to answer in more substantive ways. There's a lot of stuff coming up, and some of it you may have actually come out before this because I don't really see things in order, but I will have this all for you. And we'll continue this engagement. I hope that Chris takes this in the spirit that it's in, which is sincere and fair engagement and trying to present his ideas as fairly as possible and going in the oppositional antagonism, which makes an intellectual dialectic between individuals possible. It's not out of fear, and it is not out of hate, and it is not out of just me yelling or being passionate. This has to be understood and then applied, and then we can understand if any of this makes any fucking sense. All right. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. Read these texts. Read the texts that inspired them. Don't just read what you agree with. Don't just read what confirms what you already think you know. Have a good day. Thank you for your support if you support me. And if not, protect your peace. And if you can't do that, at least leave me alone. Bye.